In this video, Weathering the Storm, I'll try and explain how the Bolshevik Party recovered the ground that they had lost after the July days, and in fact started to gain further new ground in cities like Moscow. But it also shows how Trotsky explains that no revolution goes in a straight line. It goes in a series of ebbs and flows, and revolutionaries need to be able to work their way through times when the stream is against them, as well as to respond to those times when the stream is flowing in their direction. Now, at the end of July, the compromisers in charge of the government decided that they would call a state conference in Moscow on August the 13th. Whereas from their respective point of views, both the Bolsheviks and the cadets realised that what was now needed was a determined struggle for power by one or the other of them, the compromisers still hoped that this could be an event where some kind of compromise could be cobbled together with the bosses. And Kerensky specifically hoped that it would be an event that would allow him to display his qualities as saviour of the nation, to be the chosen leader. Trotsky notes that the government took care to make sure that the representation at the conference would allow an artificial equilibrium where the possessing classes would have as much say as the workers, soldiers and peasants. And in fact, when the conference assembled, it was clear that that balance had actually been set decisively in favour of the right wing. For every peasant deputy, there were equal numbers of landlords, for example. For each representative of the Soviets, there were 3 times as many delegates from the State Duma. The compromisers also knew that they couldn't afford to allow any Bolshevik speakers to sabotage their plans, so that they ruled that party factions could only speak if allowed by the conference presidium in advance. But to their shock and surprise, the Bolsheviks replied by announcing that they weren't going to take their seats at all. Instead, they were going to go out into the city to speak to the workers of Moscow. In expectation of a more welcoming environment for them than Petrograd, in fact, the reaction had already chosen Moscow as the venue for a number of counter-revolutionary conferences in August. But all of them were about to find out that the mood of the city's workers was rapidly catching up with those of their brothers and sisters in the capital. The combined effect of the provocative speeches made by the reaction in their own city, together with the new Bolshevik agitation, had stung the workers and soldiers of Moscow into action. And now the demand came from the shop floor in Moscow to call a general strike to show their opposition to the state conference. The Moscow Soviets, with their compromisers elected some time beforehand as at its head, voted to oppose the strike. But that Soviet was now out of step with the real mood of the workers below. The trade unions called the action in any case. Most of the district Soviets voted in support. One even voted, by 175 votes to 4, to demand the recall of their delegates to the main Moscow Soviet that had voted against the strike. Despite this, the night before the strike was a nervous time for the Bolsheviks. They remembered only too well how just a few weeks earlier the July demonstrations had been so poorly supported in Moscow. Just as then, the compromisers in the Moscow Soviet were doing everything they could to dissuade the workers from taking action. But the Bolsheviks had no need to worry. The August the 12th strike was solid. 400,000 workers took part in Moscow and its suburbs, and in its effect made sure that every conference delegate was made personally aware of the Moscow workers' hostility to the government. There were no lights, there were no trains running, there weren't even waiters in the restaurant. They were on strike too. Similar action, general or partial, had taken place in other cities like Kiev. And this one-day action fitted the needs of the moment perfectly. It avoided an armed clash that would only have played into the hands of the reaction. But above all, it demonstrated with absolute clarity that the Petrograd workers no longer needed to fear isolation from those of Moscow and the other main cities. Trotsky quotes from the Proletarian, the new Petrograd organ of the party, before, of course, it was also shut down. It put a question to the compromisers. From Petrograd, you went to Moscow. Where will you go from there? And as Trotsky says, even the masters of the situation must have put that question to themselves. Now, the Bolsheviks had used these events to hammer home their message that the state conference was really being called to prepare a conspiracy against the revolution. And actually, this was no exaggeration. In the days before the conference, Kornilov had ordered 4 cavalry divisions to get ready to move on Petrograd. A Cossack regiment sent to Moscow to preserve order had only been held up by Kerensky's command. Rumours of an impending insurrection spread. Later testimony suggests that the conference wasn't actually planned as a date for the actual overthrow. Kornilov had apparently chosen a later date, August the 27th, as that date, because he hoped that the city of Riga would then have fallen to the Germans, so he could use this defeat as a pretext for his coup. And he certainly did little to defend Riga, even though it was strategically critical for the defence of Petrograd. But even the compromisers could take no chances. The Moscow Soviet elected its own secret defence committee of 6 people, and that included 2 Bolshevik representatives. Trotsky notes how the Bolsheviks, who had been forbidden entry into the barracks since the July days, were now freely admitted. Without them, it proved impossible to win over the soldiers. While in the open arena, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries were negotiating with the bourgeoisie for the creation of a strong power against the masses led by the Bolsheviks, behind the scenes, these same Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, in cooperation with the Bolsheviks, were preparing the masses for a struggle against the conspiracy of the bourgeoisie. Now, once the state conference began, Trotsky notes that to any independent observer, the debates would have had a certain air of unreality about them, because both the bourgeoisie and the compromisers sought to pretend that the reality of the gathering storm of the revolutionary masses was just some kind of unwelcome illusion. In this kind of fantasy world, the exhausted coalition was spoken of as a means to future salvation. The weak-willed Kerensky as a forceful statesman, the hated Kornilov as a beloved leader of the people. And the speeches from those 2 aspiring rulers, Kornilov and Kerensky, brought very different reactions from the divided delegates. Kerensky spoke on the 12th to applause, but mainly from the left half of the hall, Trotsky notes. He describes how Milyakov wrote that many provincials saw Kerensky in this hall for the first time, and they went out half disappointed and half indignant. Before them stood a young man with a tortured, pale face and a pose like an actor speaking his lines. This man seemed to be trying to frighten somebody and create upon all an impression of power and force of will. In reality, he evoked only a feeling of pity. So the next day, Kornilov had arranged for himself a grand entry into Moscow. A crowd of delegates, officers and other wealthy supporters greeted his train at the station. Kornilov's biography and portrait were scattered from cars and his posters pasted all over the city. Politicians, industrialists and bankers all came to visit him in his private carriage as if he were already ruler of the country. And on the 14th, it was Kornilov's turn to take the floor. And Trotsky again quotes from Milyakov's account. The short, stumpy but strong figure of a man appeared, darting piercing glances from his small black eyes in which there was a vicious glint. The hall rocked with applause. All leapt to their feet, with the exception of the soldiers. And in fact, only after a storm of abuse between the soldiers and the right-wing delegates had subsided was Kornilov able to speak. His central point, in keeping with the plan that I've outlined for his insurrection, was to condemn the measures introduced by the revolution to undermine the role of his military commanders at the front and to frighten delegates with the impending fall of Riga. To applause from the right and angry protest from the left, the Cossack General Kaledin then spelt out the demands of the military leaders to abolish the soldiers' new rights. Chidze, president of the EC, responded, giving the official declaration of the compromises. He defended the Soviets and the soldiers' committees, saying that only they could save the country from anarchy and guarantee the continuation of the war. But any concrete proposals to solve the land or national questions, let alone seek an end to the war, were conspicuous by their absence. As Trotsky puts it, in general, what they put forward seemed to have been especially designed to provoke the indignation of the masses without giving any satisfaction to the bourgeoisie. Trotsky explains that there were numerous other speakers on the 14th and 15th, but few of them were prepared to even hint at the real situation. Most deliberately set out to conceal the truth. For example, the cadet Nabokov renounced to applaud any question of Russia negotiating a separate peace, even though secretly many cadets actually saw this as the only solution to the desperate military situation. Milyakov himself pledged his full support to a government that he was already conspiring to overthrow. Rodzianko spoke of the patriotism of the military manufacturers when the press had just revealed how he had got rich supplying worthless wood for rifles. Kropotkin, founder of anarchism in Russia, was given his chance to take the floor. Trotsky notes how he asked only to join his voice to those voices which are summoning the whole Russian people to break once and for all with anti-war Zimmerwaldism. Landlords, industrialists, generals extended to this apostle of anarchism a well-earned ovation. Like every sect which founds its teaching not upon the actual development of human society, but upon the reduction to absurdity of just one of its features, anarchism explodes like a soap bubble at the moment when the social contradictions arrive at the point of war or revolution. Trotsky notes. And he adds, far from displaying a united nation with a strong government, the Moscow State Conference revealed in Milyakov's words that the country was divided into two camps between which there could be no essential reconciliation or agreement. As the meeting drew to a close, a young Cossack officer spoke to make clear that even the Cossacks were split between the generals and the ranks. When an officer cried out at him, "German march, German money," in response, the storm of protest was so fierce it almost descended into a fistfight. Kerensky tried to calmly close the conference before suddenly bursting into hysterical shrieks and cries of despair. Trotsky notes that the hall was stupefied, and this time both halves of it, the social symbol of the state conference wound up with an insufferable monologue from a melodrama. And that was the reality of Kerensky. Now, Trotsky makes some very important observations in his history about the processes that were then at work following the July days. It's worth reading out. The immediate causes of the events of a revolution are changes in the states of mind of the conflicting classes. The material relations of society merely define the channel within which these processes take place. Changes in the collective consciousness have naturally a semi-concealed character. Only when they have attained a certain degree of intensity do the new moods and ideas break to the surface in the form of mass activities which establish a new, although again very unstable, social equilibrium. It is impossible to find your way among the manoeuvres of the leaders without searching out the deep molecular processes in the minds of the masses. In July, the workers and soldiers were defeated, but in October, they seized the power. What happened in their heads during those 4 months? Here the reader will find it necessary to go back to the July defeat. It is often necessary to step back a few paces in order to make a good leap. And before us is that October leap. In the official Soviet histories, the opinion has become established that the July attack upon the party went by almost without leaving a trace upon the workers' organisations. That is utterly untrue. The decline, to be sure, didn't last very long, not longer than a few weeks, but the defeat of the workers and soldiers of the capital was bound to produce an enormous impression. Fright, disappointment, apathy flowed down differently in different parts of the country, but they were to be observed everywhere. Trotsky explains how in Petrograd, immediately after the July days, the right-wing gangs didn't just set upon Bolshevik offices, they also targeted buildings belonging to the unions, to district Soviets, even to the Mensheviks. Passers-by simply looking like workers or suspected of being Bolsheviks could be beaten up without warning. The members of the Bolsheviks' leading bodies retreated to the Vyborg district. Their printing plants had been destroyed, and for several weeks no printer would risk producing their material. The party's activities became semi-legal, and so the Bolsheviks relied on their work in the unions and factory committees. In the political arena, only Martov and his group at the extreme left of the Mensheviks spoke up for the revolution at all. The July events also hit the Petrograd garrison particularly hard. The soldiers had been quickest to come out onto the streets, but now also retreated the furthest. Trotsky adds, it was exactly in these most revolutionary regiments, which had marched in the front in the July days, and therefore received the most furious blows, that the influence of the party fell the lowest. The military organisation of the Bolsheviks was compelled to draw in very decidedly. In Kronstadt, the party lost about 250 members. Trotsky adds that events went the same way in Moscow, and with some exceptions to the rule, even worse again in the provinces. One worker reported how he attended a meeting of the Moscow District Soviet soon after the July days. I saw that there were none too many of our comrade Bolsheviks. Steklov, one of the energetic comrades, came right up close to me and asked, "Is it true that they brought Lenin and Zinoviev in a sealed train? Is it true that they are working on German money?" My heart sank. Reports from the region around Moscow describe distinct hostility to the party, with speakers even being beaten up. The Bolsheviks were forced to withdraw not only from the Soviets, but even from trade union work in these areas. Membership fell off rapidly, and in some of the southern provinces, there was no remaining party organisation at all. In Kiev, the Bolsheviks recorded a mere 6% of votes in elections to the local Duma, and the party paper had to go back from daily to weekly production. The disbandment and transfer of the more revolutionary regiments, Trotsky notes, must in itself not only have lowered the political level of the garrisons, but also grievously affected the local workers, who felt firmer when friendly troops were standing behind the backs. As might have been expected, the reaction at the front was particularly fierce. Special reactionary units of duty to the free fatherland were set up and used alongside Cossacks to help root out Bolshevik agitators. However, while the officers' oppression might have frightened the troops for a while, it couldn't win their support. While on the surface there appeared to be some restoration of the previous army discipline, Trotsky describes how under it a burning hatred for the officers were developing. If the soldiers had become more restrained, he notes, it was only because they had learned to a certain extent to discipline their hatred. When the dams broke, their feelings were only the more clearly revealed.